The morning Lucy Lockhart arrived in Redemption Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1883, she was carrying a cracked ceramic jar wrapped in the hem of her traveling coat, and she dared any man within 10 feet of her to jostle her arm. Nobody did. Not because they were particularly gentlemanly about it. The men of Redemption Creek were a rough-edged collection of cattle hands, miners and drifters who had not met a social grace they could not trample, but because Lucy's expression made it abundantly clear that she would not forgive the accident. Her jaw was set the way iron sets when it cools. Her dark brown eyes moved over the crowd at the stage stop with the assessing precision of a woman who had learned to size up a room before she stepped fully into it. She was 26 years old, narrow-shouldered but not slight, with hands that were rough from work and a posture that suggested she had been carrying something heavier than luggage for a very long time. The ceramic jar had belonged to her mother. Her mother was dead. The jar was cracked down one side from the journey, and Lucy was not going to let it break the rest of the way. Redemption Creek itself was exactly the kind of town that Lucy had expected, and exactly the kind she had hoped to avoid. The main street was a long ribbon of dried mud and horse manure flanked by a general store, a saloon, a small church that looked as though it had been built apologetically, a blacksmith shop, and a scattering of wooden structures that could have been anything from a dentist's office to a storage shed. The sky above it all was enormous and pale blue and indifferent, the way Texas sky always seemed to be, as though it were watching from too great a distance to be involved. She had come here because her late mother's sister, Aunt Vera, had written to her from Redemption Creek the previous October with an offer that had been blunt and generous in equal measure. The letter had said simply, "I am getting old, my hip is no good, I have a house and a small piece of land and a kitchen garden and I need help. Come if you want. I will not beg." Lucy had folded the letter and looked out the window of the boarding house in San Antonio where she had been living for 2 years, working as a seamstress, and she had thought about the word beg. She had thought about the word need, and she had packed her trunk. The stage stop was operated by a man named Hector Briggs, who was round and sweating, and who waved her toward a bench with the distracted authority of a man who had processed many arrivals and had learned to move them along efficiently. Lucy sat on the bench and held the jar in her lap and watched the town while she waited for someone from Vera's house to come and collect her. That was when she first saw Stephen Dalton. He came around the corner of the blacksmith shop leading a horse with a wrapped foreleg. The horse was a large bay, well-muscled but favoring its left front, and Stephen was walking it slowly, matching its pace without rushing it, speaking to it in a low, continuous murmur that Lucy could not hear from where she sat, but could tell by the rhythm of his lips was steady and unhurried. He was not a young man in the reckless, unfinished sense. She put him at 29 or 30, and he was not particularly remarkable to look at in the way of men who made a point of being looked at. He was tall but not dramatically so, lean through the shoulders, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face that was weathered from outdoor work, a jaw that carried 2 days of stubble, and hands that were large and deliberate in the way they moved along the horse's neck. What stopped her from looking away was the care of it. He crouched down beside the horse's wrapped leg and ran his fingers along the bandage with the concentration of a man diffusing something explosive, not because it was dramatic, but because the thing deserved that degree of attention. The horse shifted and tossed its head, and Stephen spoke to it again without looking up, one hand resting flat and warm against the animal's flank. He was not showing off this care. There was no audience he was performing it for. He was simply doing it because the horse was in pain and deserved to be treated with precision. Lucy looked away before he could look up and catch her watching. Vera's neighbor, a thin woman named Mrs. Paducah, arrived 10 minutes later driving a buckboard and apologizing for being late. Lucy climbed up beside her, held the jar carefully as they rolled over the rutted street, and did not look back at the blacksmith shop. Vera was waiting on the porch of her house at the edge of town, which sat on a quarter-acre of fenced land with a kitchen garden that was already showing the first green of spring. She was 62, and had the look of a woman who had once been formidable and had not entirely stopped. Her hip made her list slightly to the left when she walked, and she walked with a cane that she used as a pointing implement as much as a support, directing Lucy's attention to the garden beds, the well, the chicken coop, the back fence that needed mending, and the storage shed where the tools were kept, all within the first 5 minutes of arrival. Lucy set the jar on the kitchen windowsill where it would catch the morning light. The crack ran from the lip down to about a third of the way. It did not leak. It held. "What's in it?" Vera asked. "Nothing," Lucy said. "It's just the jar." Vera looked at her for a moment and then nodded and did not ask again. Over the following 2 weeks, Lucy settled into the routine of the house with the efficiency of someone who had never had the luxury of settling slowly. She repaired the back fence, turned the kitchen garden beds, reorganized the supply cupboard, and took over the twice-weekly trip to the general store. Redemption Creek was not a large town. The population sat somewhere around 300 souls, depending on the season and the cattle drives, and she became familiar with its geography quickly. The saloon was called the Copper Spur. The church was presided over by a Reverend Aldous who had a kind face and a booming voice. The general store was run by a German man named Franz Kettler who was meticulous about credit. She learned the social architecture of the town with equal efficiency. There were hierarchies here, as there were everywhere. The cattle ranchers who owned land were at the top of the local order. Below them were the tradespeople and shopkeepers. Below them were the cowboys and ranch hands who passed through seasonally, who drank at the Copper Spur and occasionally caused trouble, and were not considered permanent members of the community. Women like Lucy, unattached, working, arrived without a husband, occupied a social position that was not hostile exactly but was watchful. People were curious about her in the way people in small towns are curious about anything new, which is to say intensely and not always kindly. She heard about Stephen Dalton for the first time from Mrs. Paducah, who had taken it upon herself to provide Lucy with an ongoing catalog of the town's inhabitants. "Stephen Dalton runs the Dalton cattle operation north of town," Mrs. Paducah said, pouring coffee in Vera's kitchen while Vera rested her hip. "About 2,000 head, maybe more by now. Good family, the Daltons. His father built the ranch from nothing back in the 60s. Stephen took it over 5 years ago when his father died. He's fair, they say, pays his men well. Doesn't drink to excess. Goes to church when he can." She paused. "He's not married." "I did not ask if he was married," Lucy said. "No," Mrs. Paducah agreed, "but I thought I would mention it." Lucy had been in Redemption Creek for 3 weeks before she spoke to Stephen Dalton for the first time. It happened at the general store, which was not remarkable in itself because the general store was where most introductions in Redemption Creek seemed to take place. What was notable was that it began with a dropped egg. Lucy was reaching for a tin of baking powder on the upper shelf when the small basket she was holding caught on the edge of the counter and tipped. 3 eggs rolled out. 2 hit the wooden floor and broke in the ordinary catastrophic way of eggs on hard surfaces. The 3rd rolled toward the edge of the counter, and Stephen Dalton, who had been standing 2 feet away examining a coil of rope, caught it with one hand without looking. He did not fumble. He did not crush it. He simply extended his hand, and the egg was there, intact, resting in his palm as gently as if he had been expecting it. He set it back on the counter. "Thank you," Lucy said, in a tone that was polite but not warm. "No trouble," he said. He looked at the 2 broken eggs on the floor and then at her, and there was nothing in his expression that suggested he was waiting for her to be embarrassed or grateful or charming. He simply looked at her in the direct and uncomplicated way of a man who was accustomed to looking at things straight on. "I'll get you a cloth," he said, and he went to find Kettler before she could tell him not to bother. He came back with a cloth and helped her clean the floor. He did not make conversation while he did it. He did not try to charm her out of the mild irritation that was clearly readable on her face. He cleaned his half of the floor thoroughly and handed the cloth back to Kettler and went back to looking at the rope as though nothing had happened. Lucy finished her shopping and walked back to Vera's house with the surviving egg in the bottom of the basket. "He sounds like a decent man," Vera said that evening when Lucy told the story without entirely meaning to. "He caught an egg," Lucy said. "That is not a character recommendation." "No," Vera said, "but it is something." Lucy did not respond to this. She was thinking about the way the egg had simply been there in his hand, whole and unbroken, and about how sure he had seemed that he could hold something fragile without it coming to harm. She had spent most of her adult life disproving that certainty in other men. Her father had been a man of considerable charm and considerable recklessness, and he had moved through the world breaking things with enthusiasm. He had broken the family's financial situation twice before she was 15, had broken her mother's spirit incrementally over 20 years, and had finally broken their home for good when he left for California with a mining claim and a woman 15 years younger, and never came back. Her mother had died 2 years after that, of what the doctor called pneumonia and what Lucy privately called defeat. The ceramic jar with the crack in it had sat on her mother's kitchen windowsill for the last decade of her mother's life, holding dried lavender, and Lucy had kept it because it was the most honest object she owned, beautiful, functional, damaged, and still holding on. After her father, there had been one other man of significance, a man named Robert Hale whom she had nearly married in San Antonio, who had been persuasive and attentive until the moment she had trusted him with something she had never trusted anyone with, which was the truth about her family's poverty and her own fear of it, and who had then found reasons to disentangle himself with what he had clearly considered tact. She had found it excruciating. She had found it instructive. She had decided then, with the clarity that comes from a certain kind of pain, that she did not believe any man could be trusted with something fragile. Not truly, not when it mattered. This was not bitterness, she told herself. It was accuracy. The spring moved forward with its usual insistence. The kitchen garden produced spinach and early radishes. The chickens increased their laying. Lucy repaired 2 more sections of the back fence, whitewashed the porch railing, and baked bread twice a week for Vera and occasionally for Mrs. Paducah, who brought eggs in exchange. The rhythm of the work suited her. It had weight and texture and specific outcomes. You did the thing was done, you could see it. She preferred this to the open-ended uncertainty of people. She encountered Stephen Dalton 3 more times over the following weeks, always briefly, always in public. Once at the church, where she sat with Vera and he sat 2 rows ahead and to the left, and she noticed that he sang the hymns quietly and without self-consciousness. Once on the main street when he was tying his horse outside the Copper Spur, not going in, she noted, but meeting a man on the porch, and he tipped his hat to her when she walked by. Once at the edge of town where she had gone to sketch the landscape, something she had done since childhood as a way of quieting her mind, and he rode past on the road with 2 of his ranch hands, and he did not stop, but he slowed enough to say good afternoon with the ease of a man who could greet strangers without making it into anything more than a greeting. She thought about him more than she thought she should. It was Mrs. Paducah who engineered the real introduction, in the way that women in small towns have always engineered such things, through a dinner in early May at Mrs. Paducah's own house, to which both Lucy and Stephen were invited along with 4 other people, including Reverend Aldous and his wife and the Kettlers. Lucy suspected the design of it when she arrived and saw the seating arrangement, but she had decided on the ride over that she was not going to be managed, and the best way not to be managed was to be perfectly pleasant and give no one anything to work with. She sat across from Stephen at the table, not beside him, which was marginally better. He was dressed in a clean shirt and a jacket that fit him well, and he had cut his hair recently, and he looked slightly uncomfortable with the formality in the way of a man more accustomed to outdoor clothes. He ate properly and listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, it was to ask questions rather than to make pronouncements. He asked Franz Kettler about a supply problem Kettler had mentioned in passing. He asked Reverend Aldous about the condition of the church roof. Asked Lucy, when the conversation turned in her direction, what had brought her to Redemption Creek, and she told him the truth that her aunt needed help, without any of the softening self-deprecation that women were expected to apply to practical necessity. He nodded as though that was a perfectly sensible thing to have done, which it was. "Do you like it here?" he asked. She considered the question seriously, which was the only way she considered questions. "I like the sky," she said, "and the garden. The town is louder than I expected for its size. The copper spur accounts for most of that," he said, "so I have noticed." The conversation moved on. After dinner, while the other guests gathered in the small parlor, Lucy stepped out onto Mrs. Paducah's back porch for air. It was a warm evening, and the sky was enormous and full of stars, the kind of sky that made you feel the world was much larger than the small part of it you occupied. Stephen came out a few minutes later. He did not appear to have followed her specifically. He had a pipe in his hand that suggested he had come out for the same reason men generally stepped onto porches after dinner. And he stood at the far end of the porch and said nothing for a while, which she appreciated more than any opening line would have been. "I heard you play the hymns," she said finally, because it had been in her mind since the church. He glanced at her with an expression of mild surprise. "I was not aware I was audible." "You were not loud," she said. "I just have sharp ears." He was quiet for a moment. "My mother taught me," he said. "She was particular about hymns." "Is she still in Redemption Creek?" "She died 8 years ago, before my father." "I am sorry." "Thank you." He said it without the awkwardness that condolences often produce in people who are not comfortable with death. He said it like a man who had made his peace with the fact of it and was still sad about it, which seemed to her the honest response. She went inside shortly after. She thought about the steadiness of him for 2 days without entirely admitting to herself that she was doing so. It was the middle of May when the incident with the bird happened, and that was what began to change things. Lucy had been hanging the weeks washing on the line behind Vera's house when she heard a sound near the fence, a small, distressed, irregular sound. She found, wedged between the bottom rail and the ground where the wood had warped, a small finch with a wing that was clearly not holding its proper angle. It was alive and extremely alarmed. Lucy knelt in the dirt in her working dress and spent 10 minutes coaxing it out without grabbing, using a patient sideways movement of her hands until the bird hopped into a direction she guided it, and she lifted it with both hands, cupped the way she had been taught to lift fragile things. She did not know what to do with an injured bird. Vera, when consulted, said she thought someone on one of the ranches kept birds and might know something. Mrs. Paducah, who arrived in the afternoon on her usual visiting schedule, said without much preamble that she believed Stephen Dalton had some experience with such things. "He raised a crow once," she said. "Found it as a nestling. It lived for years." Then she looked at Lucy with the complete innocence of a woman who has arranged something and knows it. Lucy looked back at her with equal innocence and said that she would send a note. She sent the note that afternoon, and the following morning Stephen appeared at Vera's gate, which he opened and closed behind him with attention to the latch. He was in his working clothes, dust-worn trousers, a work shirt with the sleeves rolled, his hat, and he looked completely at ease in the way that people who work outdoors are always slightly more comfortable than people who don't. Lucy met him at the gate and showed him the bird, which she had been keeping in a small wooden crate lined with cloth in the kitchen. He looked at it with the same focused attention she had seen him direct at the horse's bandaged leg. "Wing is dislocated," he said. "Not broken, I think. Can it be fixed?" He picked up the bird from the crate, and this was the thing that stopped her, that she watched without looking like she was watching. He picked it up with the same assurance and gentleness he had used when he caught the egg, as though handling a thing that was small and living and frightened was something his hands understood how to do instinctively. No performance, no excess, just the right amount of pressure in exactly the right place. The bird did not thrash. It stilled almost immediately, which surprised her. "It needs to be splinted," he said. He looked up at her. "Do you have any thin strips of cloth? Very thin." She went inside and came back with what he asked for. He splinted the wing with a strip of cloth so fine she had not thought it would hold anything, and the whole time he spoke to the bird in the same low, continuous murmur she had noticed with the horse, steady and unhurried, not demanding stillness, but providing a kind of calm that the animal could choose to accept or not. It accepted. "Keep it warm," he said, setting it back in the crate. "Feed it insects if you can catch them, mealworms if you can get them from Kettler. In 2 weeks try the wing." He stood and looked at her. "You can do this yourself." "I know," she said. She meant it as a statement of competence, not pride. He seemed to hear it as that. "Good," he said. He looked at the crate for a moment. "You have a steady hand." She looked at him then, full on. "As do you," she said. They stood in her kitchen with a crate between them and the morning light coming through the window onto the cracked jar of dried lavender, and something shifted between them that she could not name and did not try to. He left a few minutes later, tipping his hat at the gate. She fed the bird mealworms from a small spoon for 2 weeks. In June, Vera had a bad week with her hip. The pain increased sharply after she tried to manage the well herself while Lucy was at the store, and the doctor, a young man named Dr. Finch, who had arrived in Redemption Creek the previous year and was still earning the town's trust, recommended strict rest. Lucy took on everything. She did not complain about this, not even internally, in the way that people who have always worked do not complain about work. But the days were long and the evenings were longer, and she was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the body. Stephen came by on a Tuesday afternoon, for no announced reason, with a wrapped portion of venison from what she gathered was a recent hunt. He left it at the gate with a note that said simply, "For Vera. I heard she was having a difficult time." He did not knock. He did not require a conversation. He left the thing and went. Lucy read the note 3 times. She thought about what it meant to leave something without requiring acknowledgement. She had known very few people who could do that. She wrote him a thank you note that was more than polite and less than warm, which was, she admitted to herself, more than she had given most people. He came back the following Saturday with the excuse of checking on the bird, which was recovering well and had in fact that morning been moving its wing experimentally. He looked at the wing and declared it well on its way, and then he stood in the kitchen and she poured him coffee because it would have been rude not to. And they talked about the garden and the weather and Redemption Creek's upcoming summer fair, which apparently drew people from several counties and was considered one of the more significant social events of the year. "Vera will want to go," Lucy said, "if her hip permits." "I expect it will," Stephen said. "She is not a woman who stays put easily." "No," Lucy agreed. There was a warmth in her voice when she said it that she had not planned. He noticed. She knew he noticed because of the very slight change in his expression. Not a smile exactly, not yet, but something that intended to be one. He stayed an hour, and when he left she stood at the window and watched him go out through the gate, and she thought, careful, not about him, about herself. The summer fair arrived in the 3rd week of June, which was early for summer in Texas, but the town had always held it in June, and tradition in small towns is inflexible on such matters. Vera's hip was marginally better, and she was determined to attend, which meant Lucy borrowed Mrs. Paducah's buckboard and drove them both in. The fairground was set up in the field behind the church, with booths selling food and goods, a ring for horse events, a pie contest that Vera had apparently dominated for 3 consecutive years before her hip slowed her down, and a general atmosphere of carefully managed festivity. Lucy had not been to anything like this in years. San Antonio had its events, but she had always been too tired from work to attend them with the full attention they deserved. Here, for some reason she could not entirely explain, she found herself present to it in a way she had forgotten she could be. The smell of fry bread and wood smoke. The sound of a fiddle being tuned somewhere behind the food tent. Vera's commentary on every booth they passed, which was brisk and specific and often funny. She saw Stephen across the grounds, talking to two other ranchers near the horse ring. He was not performing ease the way some men performed ease. It simply was the way he was. He laughed at something one of the other men said, and it was a genuine laugh, the kind that uses the whole face. He saw her about 20 minutes later and came across the grass with the unhurried directness that seemed to be his characteristic mode of movement, not hurrying and not delaying. "Miss Lockhart," he said. "Mrs. Hardwick." This last to Vera, who beamed at him with the complete transparency of a woman who had decided she liked someone and saw no reason to conceal it. They walked together for a while, all three of them, which was correct and comfortable, through the booths. He bought Vera a lemonade with the ease of a man who sees a need and addresses it without discussion. He asked Lucy about a sketch she was carrying, which she had brought because she could not resist the visual material of the fair, and she showed it to him reluctantly and then less reluctantly as he looked at it with genuine interest. "You draw well," he said. "You have a very exact line." "My father was an engineer," she said. "Before he was other things." He did not ask about the other things, which was exactly right. "Is that where you learned?" Watching him, she said. He was very precise about lines, less precise about everything else. It was more than she meant to say. She was slightly surprised to have said it. He absorbed it without making it into something bigger than it was. "My father was precise about horses and imprecise about finances," he said. "I spent 3 years after he died sorting out what he owed to whom. Did you manage it?" "Eventually. It was instructive." "That word covers a great deal," she said. He looked at her with something that was very close to a smile. "Yes," he said. "I suppose it does." At the edge of the grounds, where the afternoon light came in low and gold across the grass, there was a booth selling small hand-thrown pottery. Lucy stopped to look at it, drawn by habit, and she found herself standing in front of a small blue ceramic jar that was almost exactly the same shape as her mother's. Not cracked, whole and smooth and the color of a particular kind of sky. She stood there longer than she had meant to. Stephen, who had been saying something to Vera, came to stand beside her. He did not ask what she was looking at. He just looked at it with her for a moment. "It's a good piece," he said finally. "Yes," she agreed. She put it down and moved on. He bought it a few minutes later. She didn't see him do it, but when they were leaving the fair and she was helping Vera up into the buckboard, she felt him press something into her hands wrapped in a piece of cloth, and he said simply, "For the windowsill." She felt the shape through the cloth. She did not say anything for a moment, which was unusual for her. "Thank you," she said. The words felt inadequate, but she did not have better ones. "You looked like someone who might want a jar that does not have to work quite so hard," he said. And there was such an exact and quiet understanding in the statement that she turned to look at him properly. He was looking back at her, and there it was finally, the smile. And it was quieter than she had expected, which was somehow more overwhelming than anything louder would have been. He helped Vera with the buckboard step with the same natural care that he applied to everything. He said goodbye to both of them. He walked back toward the fairground. Lucy drove home with the blue jar in her lap and her hands on the reins, and Vera saying nothing, which was Vera's way of saying everything. She placed the blue jar on the windowsill beside the cracked one that night. She stood and looked at them both for a long time. It was July before she admitted to herself that she was in serious danger of feeling something she had decided not to feel. She admitted it to herself on a Thursday evening, sitting in the kitchen after Vera had gone to bed, with the lamp turned low and the sound of the night outside coming through the window screen, and she sat with it the way she sat with difficult things, directly and without excessive noise. She felt it. She named it. She was afraid of it. She was afraid because she believed, had proved to herself with considerable evidence, that men did not know what to do with fragile things, with the inner things, the ones that did not have edges you could see. The tender arrangements of trust and hope that a person builds quietly over time, and that can be knocked down with so little force by someone who does not know they are standing in a room full of such structures. She had been in that room. She had watched the structures fall. She had spent 4 years in San Antonio becoming a person who did not put anything fragile in a place where it could be reached, which was also the description of a person who was very good at being alone. And now here was this man who caught eggs and splinted bird wings and bought blue jars and left venison at gates without requiring a conversation. And she did not know what to do with him, except that she could feel herself doing something anyway, and she was not sure she could stop it. She was also not sure she wanted to. In mid-July, one of Stephen's ranch hands came to the door to let her know that Stephen was asking whether she might want to ride out to see the ranch. He had extended this as an invitation for both her and Vera, but Vera's hip was having another difficult week, and she declined with what Lucy recognized as strategic enthusiasm, pressing Lucy to go alone and not making her feel managed about it, which was the more sophisticated form of management. Lucy went. She told herself she was going because it was a polite thing to do, and because she had been in Redemption Creek 3 months and had not been more than 2 miles from the town center, and she did not examine this reasoning too closely. The Dalton Ranch sat north of town in the lap of a shallow valley, with a main house that had been built to last and had been maintained in that spirit, a row of outbuildings that were orderly without being rigid, and a pasture that ran to the low ridge in the northwest with a stream cutting through it. It was, she recognized as soon as she saw it, a place that had been cared for over a long time. You could see it in the way the fences were kept, and the way the horses moved in the pasture, and the way the men who were working around the yards moved competent and unhurried, without the frantic edge of an operation that was always fighting the last crisis. Stephen gave her a tour that was practical and unshowy. He showed her the horse operation, which was clearly his particular interest, and explained the stock he was developing, crossing a line of quarter horses with a strain from further east, with a detailed enthusiasm that he seemed slightly self-conscious about, as though he wasn't sure she would want the detail. She found herself wanting it. "What makes this cross worth the investment?" she asked. He looked at her with something that was not surprise exactly but was a recalibration, as though he was adjusting an estimate. "The quarter horse is fast and smart in short distances, but the eastern line handles elevation and longer days better," he said. "I think you can get both in the same animal if you're careful about which animals you're pairing. And how long until you know if it works?" 3-4 years, he said. "You're betting on what the foals grow into. That is a long time to commit to something you cannot guarantee." "Yes," he said. He was looking at her when he said it, and she was aware that they were not entirely talking about horses anymore, but he did not push the subtext, just let it exist between them. He showed her the main house, which had a kitchen that was functional and a sitting room that had books and a fireplace and 2 chairs that had been used a great deal and a photograph of his parents on the mantelpiece. She looked at the photograph for a long time. His mother was a small woman with a direct look, and his father was large and comfortable, and they stood together like people who had settled into proximity without having to think about it anymore. "They seem happy," she said. "They were," he said. "Not always, I think, but mostly." "That is a realistic thing to say. I think they would prefer to be described as happy," he said, "but I prefer to be accurate." She turned to look at him. He was watching her with an expression that was open and serious and very direct. "So do I," she said. He made coffee and they sat in the kitchen and talked for 2 hours. It was the longest sustained conversation she had had with anyone except Vera in months, and it did not feel long. They talked about Texas history, which he knew well and she knew partially. They talked about books, and she was pleased to find that his library was actually used. They talked about what they both remembered from before they became the people they currently were, the childhood things that stick, and she found herself telling him about the engineer father and the precise lines and the way she had learned to draw by tracing the things she could not otherwise understand, which was her way of making difficult things comprehensible. "What kinds of things?" he asked. "Architecture," she said. "Machinery. People sometimes. If I draw a person, I can sometimes understand them better than if I just look at them. Have you drawn me? The question was direct and quiet and not quite flirtatious, but it was close enough to flirtatious that she felt the heat in it. Not yet, she said, which was the honest answer. He nodded as though that was a reasonable and informative answer, which she supposed it was. She rode back to town in the late afternoon with the sun behind her and the town ahead and the sound of the ranch fading. She felt, she admitted to herself, lighter. It was the feeling of having been in the company of someone who did not require her to perform anything. She was not sure she trusted it yet. She drew him that night from memory. She studied the sketch for a long time and then put it in her sketchbook between 2 pages that she did not often open and closed the book. August brought heat and drought warnings, and a range fire 15 miles to the east that sent a thin smoke smell over the town for 3 days before the rains finally came and smothered it. The fire was not a crisis for Redemption Creek directly, but it required the ranchers in the area to coordinate water and resources and emergency grazing, which Stephen was involved in to a significant degree. Lucy heard about this through Mrs. Paducah and through the general store gossip, and through the fact that Stephen was absent from town for 2 weeks dealing with it. She noticed his absence in a way that irritated her, because it confirmed what she already knew, which was that she had been looking forward to seeing him in the casual way that things become habitual before you have formally decided to form the habit. He came back from the fire coordination in the 2nd week of August, and he came by Vera's house on his way back through town, dust-covered and tired in the straightforward way of physical exhaustion, to check on the bird, which had been released into the garden a week earlier and was apparently doing well. The bird had in fact been roosting in the large elm at the back of the garden and had shown a fondness for the sill of the kitchen window. "It comes back," she told him. "They do sometimes," he said. He was leaning against the gate looking at the elm, and she was standing on the porch steps, and the late afternoon light was brutal and beautiful the way August light in Texas is. He looked tired and very real. "How is Vera?" "Better this week. She made a pie yesterday." "That is a good sign." She came down the porch steps and opened the gate. "Come in and have something to eat," she said. "You look like a man who has not sat down in 2 weeks." He came in and she made him a meal from what was available: bread and cold beef and beans and coffee. And he ate it with the sincere appreciation of someone who was actually hungry, not performing gratitude but simply experiencing relief. She sat across from him at the kitchen table and Vera came in from the sitting room, and the 3 of them talked while he ate, and it was easy in a way that ease is not supposed to be this early. Afterward, when Vera had gone back to her rest, Stephen remained at the kitchen table with his coffee, and the kitchen was quiet and warm, and Lucy thought about what she was going to say before she said it, and then said it anyway. "I want to tell you something," she said, "and I want you to understand that I do not tell it as a way of creating expectation or making an appeal. I am telling it because I think you are a person who would rather know a thing than not know it." He put down his coffee cup and looked at her steadily. "All right," he said. "I had a difficult time with trust," she said. "With men specifically. I have had people, my father and one other person of significance, take something that was given in trust and be careless with it. Not cruelly, not maliciously, but carelessly, which is its own kind of damage." She paused. "I decided after the last of it that I did not believe any man could truly be trusted with something fragile, something that does not have edges you can see. I still mostly believe that." He was quiet for a moment. "And the mostly," he said, "is you," she said, "being careful with things." He looked at her for a long time. The lamp on the table made a quiet light between them. "I cannot tell you I will always be right," he said. "I have been wrong about things. I have misjudged people. I have not always known when I was doing damage." He said it without the defensive inflation that apologies sometimes take. He said it as information. "But I can tell you that I would rather know what I'm holding than be surprised by it, and I would rather be wrong carefully than right carelessly." She looked at him. She looked at his hands on the table, which were still, and she thought about the egg and the bird and the jar and the venison and the way he opened and closed gates with attention to the latch. "I know," she said. "That is what I am trying to tell you." He reached across the table slowly and put his hand over hers, and she let him. Outside the window, the finch was somewhere in the elm tree in the dark, alive and healed, and making its home in a garden where someone had been careful with it. The weeks that followed were the weeks of something beginning properly, slowly, with the careful pace of two people who were not reckless by nature. He called on her with appropriate frequency, twice a week sometimes once, sometimes accompanied by Vera, who took a proprietary satisfaction in the proceedings that she only barely disguised. They took one formal ride together, which was not romantic by design, but became so by the quality of the afternoon, riding out toward the ridge north of his ranch, where you could see the whole valley spread out below in the late September light like something from a painting. She showed him her sketchbooks. Not the one with his portrait in it, not yet, but the others, the architectural sketches and the landscape drawings and the studies of birds and horses and the faces of people she had known. He looked at them with the same focused attention he gave to everything that merited it, which was most things. "These are extraordinary," he said. He was not flattering her. He was stating a finding. "They are useful to me," she said. "Whether they are extraordinary is not something I am objective about." "I am," he said, "and they are." She looked at him. He was looking at a sketch she had done of her mother's hands from memory, her mother's hands holding a cup of tea, the way they had always held it, with both palms around the bowl of it for the warmth. He was looking at it the way you look at something that has shown you more than you expected. "That is your mother," he said, not a question. "Yes," she said. "She was precise," he said, "even in her hands." Lucy felt something in her chest unlock, some small room she had kept bolted for a long time. She showed him the sketch of his portrait that evening. She opened the book to it and handed it to him without saying anything, and he looked at it for a long time and then looked at her, and there was something in his face that she did not have words for, but that she recognized as the feeling of being known. "You drew this from memory," he said. "Yes." "When?" "July," she said, "after I visited the ranch." He looked at it again. "I look like I'm thinking about something difficult," he said. "You usually are," she said. "It is one of the things I find interesting about you." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Lucy," and he said her name the way you say the name of a place you have been trying to find for a long time and have finally recognized, and she thought she had never heard her own name sound quite like that. "Yes," she said. He asked permission before he kissed her. He said simply, "May I?" And she said yes, and he kissed her carefully in the way that he did everything, as though getting it right mattered to him more than getting it done quickly. It was September, and she had arrived in the spring, and she had spent the months between becoming someone who believed in a different possibility than she had believed in before. October arrived, and with it the shift toward autumn, which in this part of Texas was less a transformation than a softening, the brutal heat easing back into warm days and cool nights, the light going golden in the late afternoon and lasting longer in that gold than it did anywhere else she had lived. Lucy loved October in Redemption Creek in the specific way you love a thing you had not expected to love. She loved other things too. She was admitting them to herself in the orderly fashion of a person who preferred to acknowledge things one at a time. She loved the way Stephen dismounted, which was efficient and unhurried. She loved that he kept his promises, which she had not entirely believed was something men reliably did, and she began to believe it again based on evidence. He said he would be somewhere, and he was there. He said he would send something, and it arrived. He said he would think about a question and came back with an answer. She loved that he did not try to fix things that were not broken. He did not look at the cracked jar on her windowsill and suggest she throw it out. When she told him about her mother in more detail one evening in October, over coffee on Vera's porch with the autumn air coming in from the north, he did not try to reframe the story or find the silver lining. He listened until she was done, and then he said, "That sounds like it was a long, quiet pain," and she thought she had never heard a more accurate description of it. Yes, she said. That is exactly what it was. He reached for her hand and held it, and she let him hold it without feeling the need to pull back, which was new. The holding felt steady. It felt like the right amount of weight. She was in love with him. She knew this with the same clarity she brought to everything else she knew. She had not been planning to be in love with anyone, and she was not sure what to do with the fact that she was, except to acknowledge it and then, eventually, say it. She said it in November. They were in the sitting room of the ranch house, which she had by then visited many times and which felt less like a strange place every time. A fire was burning. He had been reading and she had been sketching by the lamp, both of them occupying the same space the way people occupy space when they have stopped being careful about it. When she put the sketchbook down and said, "I love you. I wanted you to know that." He closed his book. He looked at her with the expression she had come to know, the one that meant he was present to what was happening and would not look away from it. "I love you," he said. "I have been trying to find the right moment to say it." "I got tired of waiting for a right moment," she said. "That seems efficient," he said. He was smiling. The smile was the one she had first seen at the summer fair, quiet and warm, and it still did to her what it had done the first time. "Don't make fun of me," she said. "I would never make fun of you for saying something true," he said. He stood up and crossed the room to where she was sitting and crouched down in front of her chair so they were level and took both her hands. "I love you. I have been trying to figure out how to be the kind of man who deserves to say that to you since approximately the first week I knew you. I am still working on it." "You are a great deal further along than you think," she said. He pressed her hands to his mouth for a moment and then looked up at her. "Will you marry me?" She had known it was coming. She had been thinking about it for weeks, turning it over the way she turned over things she needed to understand, looking at it from every angle. She had thought about her mother and about her father and about Robert Hale and about the cracked jar on the windowsill and the blue one beside it. She had thought about what it meant to trust something fragile to someone else's hands. She had thought about his hands. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He pressed his forehead against her hands, and she felt him exhale slowly, and she reached forward and put her hand against the side of his face, and they stayed like that for a moment in the firelight, two people who had arrived at something real. They were married in December, in the small church with the apologetically built exterior that was, on the inside, rather beautiful once you were in it. Reverend Aldous officiated with his kind face and his booming voice, and the church was full of people who had been watching the proceedings unfold since May with the invested attention of people who live in a small town and feel a proprietary relationship to the love stories that develop within it. Vera sat in the front pew in her best dress with tears on her face that she was managing to ignore by focusing on the structural integrity of her hat. Mrs. Paducah sat beside her beaming with the unambiguous satisfaction of a woman whose management of a situation has come good. Lucy wore a dress she had made herself from fabric she had ordered from a shop in Abilene, a deep blue-gray wool that caught the light from the church windows and made her look, Stephen said later, like someone who had walked in from a winter sky. She carried a small bouquet of dried lavender because fresh flowers were not available in December in Texas, and because the lavender had significance that she did not explain to anyone except Stephen, who already understood. She walked down the aisle with Vera on her arm, because there was no father to fill the role, and Vera was the right person and they both knew it. Stephen was waiting at the front of the church in a dark suit that fit him properly and his hair cut and his face clean-shaved, and when she reached him he looked at her with that expression present, direct, not looking away, and she thought that this was what she had not believed possible, a man who looked at you fully and did not flinch. They said their vows. She meant every word, and she could tell from the way he said his that he did too. Reverend Aldous pronounced them married with considerable enthusiasm. Vera cried openly and stopped trying to manage it. Mrs. Paducah applauded, which was slightly irregular, but no one stopped her. They had a wedding supper at the ranch house for the guests, who included most of the town, and the sitting room was full and warm and smelled of wood smoke, and the food that his ranch hands' wives had prepared, and there was fiddle music and dancing in the cleared dining room, and Lucy danced with Stephen and felt the particular warmth of dancing with someone whose hands you know. He leaned down and said into her ear, "Are you happy?" She thought about it seriously. "Yes," she said. "I am going to have to get used to that." He laughed and pulled her closer, and she let him. The winter was mild enough to be workable, which was fortunate because there was a great deal of work in the transition of combining two households into one life. Vera's house was the question. Vera could not be left alone, and the ranch was too far for Lucy to manage both. They solved it the way they solved most problems, by talking about it directly until the shape of an answer emerged. Stephen proposed a room in the ranch house for Vera, an expansion of the existing structure that would give her a private sitting room and bedroom on the ground floor with a door that opened onto the garden side of the house. Vera, who had been waiting to be included in the conversation, and was pleased to find that she was, accepted this with the dignity of someone who had not been certain of the outcome. Mrs. Paducah was given custody of the kitchen garden at Vera's old house and seemed genuinely gratified. The building was done in February by two skilled carpenters from town who Stephen paid in full and on time and who did good work. Vera moved into the ranch house in March with her furniture and her cane and her opinions, which she distributed at appropriate moments and otherwise kept admirably to herself. Lucy, who had been wary of what it would mean to share space with anyone, found that the ranch house was large enough that sharing it was not sharing in the confining sense, but rather in the sense of people moving through the same world and intersecting at the good moments. She found that she loved the morning specifically, the early light coming in through the kitchen window, the sound of the ranch beginning to move outside, coffee heating on the stove, Stephen coming in from the early check of the horses with the cold on his coat and color in his face, and the direct, glad way he looked at her every time he came back to where she was. Every time, without exception. Every morning he looked at her like something he was glad to return to. She told him this one morning in March, standing in the kitchen with her coffee, and he looked at her steadily and said, "I am glad to return to you every time. That is not something that will change." "How do you know?" she asked, not testing him, genuinely curious. "Because I know what I am when I am away from you," he said, "and I know what I am when I am here. The difference is not subtle." She turned back to the stove and said nothing for a moment because she needed the moment. Spring came again, and with it a year in Redemption Creek, which felt both short and impossibly full. The horse crossing project was producing its first serious foals, and Stephen was in the pasture a great deal, doing the patient observational work of someone who has bet on a long outcome and needs to know how the early returns look. Lucy went out with him sometimes, sketching the foals from the fence, and the sketches were good, and Stephen thought they were extraordinary, and they agreed, as they agreed on most things, without requiring the other to entirely capitulate. She was sketching one afternoon in April when she realized she had been unwell in the mornings for 2 weeks in a way that was consistent and that she recognized. She went to see Dr. Finch the following day. Dr. Finch confirmed what she had suspected, which was that she was expecting a child, and she rode back to the ranch in the afternoon light with this fact sitting in her chest like something warm and alarming, something she had not entirely allowed herself to want and had apparently been wanting anyway. She told Stephen that evening at the kitchen table, directly and without preamble, which was how she told him most things. She said, "I am going to have a baby. Dr. Finch thinks the autumn, September perhaps." He was perfectly still for a moment, and then his face did the thing that it did when something was affecting him more than he was going to try to put into words, which was that it became very quiet and very present, and he reached across the table and took her hand the same way he had the first time. "A baby," he said. "Yes," she said. "I realize this changes a great many things." "It changes them in the way I would want them changed," he said. He looked at her with the complete sincerity that she had stopped being surprised by and had started being grateful for. "Are you well? Are you frightened?" "I am very well," she said, "and somewhat frightened. Both can be true." "They can," he agreed. He raised her hand and pressed it to his face, and she felt him exhale, slow and sure. "We will be careful," he said. "With all of it." She believed him, completely, without the portion of doubt she had kept in reserve for so long. She believed him with the kind of certainty that is the product of evidence accumulated over months of watching a person be the same kind of careful with everything. She had changed her mind about men and fragile things. She had changed it carefully and based on proof, and she intended to keep it changed. The summer of 1884 was warm and full, and the ranch was producing well, and Stephen hired 2 additional men to handle the expanded herd while he managed things closer to home, which he did without making a point of it. He was simply more present. He appeared at the appropriate times. He carried things that were heavy without being asked to. He checked on her without hovering, which required a specific calibration that she appreciated, because hovering would have made her feel managed, and he seemed to understand this without requiring explanation. Vera was in her element. She had opinions about pregnancy that she shared selectively and always upon invitation, and she made an herbal tea from dried chamomile and peppermint that she pressed on Lucy for the morning illness, which helped more than Lucy had expected, and which she drank gratefully. Mrs. Paducah appeared regularly with food and company, and the general atmosphere of a woman who is witnessing something she approves of deeply. Lucy sketched through the summer. She sketched the foals, who were developing into exactly what Stephen had hoped for, strong and smart and manageable. She sketched the ranch in all its seasonal moods. She sketched Vera on the porch in the mornings. She sketched Stephen at the fence watching the horses with the same expression he always had when he was paying serious attention to something. And this sketch she kept and put in a frame and put on the wall of the sitting room, and he found it there and stood looking at it for a long time and then turned to her and said, "Is that how you see me?" "Yes," she said. "I look very serious," he said. "You are very serious," she said. "It is not a flaw. It is what seriousness looks like in a person who means it." He kissed her then, right there in the sitting room in the middle of the afternoon, in the way of a man who means what he says. The baby was born in early September of 1884. A boy, delivered in the ranch house by Dr. Finch, with Vera present and Stephen in the next room moving between patients and insufficient patients, in the way of men who must wait for things over which they have no practical jurisdiction. He came in when Dr. Finch opened the door, and he stood by the bed where Lucy lay with the baby, and he looked at the baby with the expression she had expected, which was the same one he had for the egg and the bird and the jar and everything small and living and requiring care. "He is very small," he said. "He will not stay small," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms, and he held him with both hands, large hands, careful hands, making a space that was exactly the right size. "He is perfect," Stephen said, and he did not mean the baby was without imperfection. The baby was red and wrinkled and making sounds like a question. He meant the baby was exactly what he was, and that was enough, more than enough. "Yes," Lucy agreed. They named him James Thomas Dalton. Thomas for Stephen's father and James for no formal reason except that it suited him. James was a solid baby, and then a solid infant who grew with the consistent intention of becoming a large person, which he appeared to have been planning from the beginning. He had Stephen's coloring and Lucy's expression, the one that looked at things carefully before deciding what to think about them. And this combination produced a child who was both well-tempered and inquisitive, which made him pleasant company from an early age. Vera was extraordinary with him. She held him with the comfort of someone who had held babies before, and she told him things in a low voice that Lucy could occasionally hear from the next room, stories, mostly, about the world and its features, delivered with the same dry precision she applied to everything. James appeared to find this agreeable. The finch, which had been part of the garden ecosystem for a year and a half now, had apparently found a mate and produced young of its own, and there was a family of finches in the elm tree, which Lucy took as a good sign without making it portentous, because she was a practical person and practical people did not invest too heavily in omens. She was happy. She recognized happiness now not as the absence of difficulty, but as the presence of something steady underneath the difficulty, a foundation that held when things were uneven above it. This foundation was built of specific things. The way Stephen made decisions, the way he kept his word, the way he held the baby, the way he looked at her, the way he had looked at the cracked jar and understood without being told that it was not garbage. It was history. Stephen's horse crossing program produced its first real success in the spring of 1885, when 3 of the foals from the previous year's crop were worked and showed exactly the combination he had been aiming for: the speed and intelligence of the quarter horse and the endurance and temperament of the Eastern line. It was a triumph of patient, careful calculation, and it opened possibilities for the ranch that were considerable. He was offered a contract that summer to supply stock to a ranching operation in New Mexico, which was significant and which would require some travel. He brought the proposition to Lucy and talked through it with her thoroughly, not as a courtesy but as a genuine process of thinking it out together. She asked useful questions, as she always did. She identified a problem with the delivery timeline that he had not noticed, which he appreciated. They made the decision together, as they made most significant decisions. He went to New Mexico in October with 2 of his best men and was gone 3 weeks, and she missed him with a specificity that she had not expected, even though she had been managing her own affairs efficiently for years. She missed the weight of him in the kitchen. She missed his footsteps. She missed the way he came in from the pasture cold and glad to be in from the cold. He came back on a Wednesday afternoon with the contract signed and a piece of silver jewelry from Santa Fe for her and a small carved horse for James, who was 14 months and impressed by it. He came through the door and she was in the kitchen, and he came directly to her and held her for a long time without saying anything, and she held him back. "Good trip," she said into his shoulder. "Successful," he said. "Long." "I would rather be here." "I know," she said. "I would rather you be here too." He pulled back and looked at her the way he did. "I love you," he said. Not as punctuation, but as the main sentence. "I love you," she said. The same. Life on the ranch settled into the rhythms of a functioning and growing enterprise through 1885 and into 1886. The herd expanded. The horse program's reputation spread. 2 of Stephen's hands married local women and built small houses on the ranch property, making the operation slightly more like a small community than a lone enterprise, which suited everyone. Vera's hip, though it never fully recovered, stabilized at a level that allowed her to move around the house and garden freely, and she managed the kitchen garden with the authority of someone who had been waiting for the right stage to reassert influence. James walked and then ran, and then talked with the considered emphasis of a small person who had been listening carefully before he decided to contribute. He was devoted to Stephen in the uncomplicated way of small children who feel safe with someone, following him to the pasture fence, and standing on the lower rail to look at the horses and occasionally saying things that were either profound or nonsense, and were difficult to distinguish at this age. Lucy's sketchbooks filled with the life of it. She had begun, this year, to think about whether the drawings had a use beyond her own need to understand things. A man named Alderton from a newspaper in Abilene had seen 2 of her sketches at the summer fair. She had entered them on a whim and had been enthusiastic in a way that suggested he might have a professional use for her work. She had not followed up yet. She was still considering whether she wanted to. She told Stephen about it in September of 1886, and he said, without hesitation, "You should talk to him. It is good work. It deserves to be seen." "It might require periodic trips to Abilene," she said. "That is manageable," he said. "James would need to come with me. Or I would manage James while you went. We have Vera. We have Eliza." Eliza was the young woman who had recently come to work in the house, married to one of the ranch hands, competent and good with James. "You are very easy about this," she said. "Why wouldn't I be?" She looked at him. She had had this question before, in the early months, about why he was so uncomplicated in his support of her, and she had eventually understood that it was not complicated for him, because he was not threatened by her competence and did not feel that her ambitions diminished anything of his. She had grown up expecting that a husband would be the ceiling through which you could not pass. Stephen was not a ceiling. He was, she had decided, more like a very good wall, structural, useful, making the room possible while not being the thing the room was for. She wrote to Mr. Alderton the following week. In December of 1886, she made her first trip to Abilene with Stephen and James, and met Alderton in his office at the paper, and showed him a portfolio of work that she had assembled with more anxiety than she showed anyone. He was impressed. He was, in fact, more than impressed. He wanted sketches, reportage work, visual journalism, the landscape and people and events of the region on a regular basis, at a rate that was not extravagant but was real money from real work, and he was clear that her name would appear with the work. She said she would think about it, which was Lucy for yes with conditions. She worked out the conditions on the train home, which was a brief luxury of speed and civilization, and she discussed them with Stephen over dinner at the hotel that night while James slept in the adjoining room. "I think it is the right thing," she said. "I know," he said. "I am not entirely sure I am good enough for a newspaper." "Lucy," he said, in the patient voice he used when she was being inaccurate, "you are good enough for several newspapers." She started contributing sketches to the Abilene paper in January of 1887 and discovered that she was, in fact, good enough, and that the work suited her in the same way that all good work suited her, which was that it had weight and texture and specific outcomes that she could see and measure. She did not become a celebrated artist. She did not need to. She became a person who produced work that mattered and was paid fairly for it and was respected for it, which was all she had ever wanted from any endeavor. The spring of 1887 was a good one. The ranch was profitable. The horses were sought after. James turned 3 and became more deliberate in his speech and more athletic in his approach to the world, climbing things and running at things with the physical confidence of a child who has never been dropped. Lucy thought about that sometimes, about the quality of the catching, the way confidence in a small person is built by the repeated demonstration that someone will be there to prevent the fall. She thought about her own childhood, which had not had enough of that, and she felt grateful in the warm and specific way that gratitude works when it is not abstract. She became pregnant again in the summer of 1887, and this time there was less alarm and more straightforward joy, though she was careful about joy by long habit and took it in the measured doses she took everything. "Another autumn baby," she told Stephen in August. "We seem to prefer them," he said. "We seem to," she agreed. This child was born in October of 1887, a girl, smaller and louder than James had been, with a quantity of dark hair that was immediately decisive. They named her Clara, which had been Vera's suggestion, and which turned out to be exactly right. Vera held Clara in the first hour of her life and was, for the first time in Lucy's observation, briefly without words. She sat with the baby and looked at her, and her face did something that Lucy had not seen it do in the year and a half she had known her. It became entirely unguarded, soft and open with wonder. "She looks like your mother," Vera said finally. "Around the eyes." Lucy felt this in the center of herself. She looked at the baby who looked like her mother, and she thought about the cracked jar on the windowsill of this ranch house, which she had moved here from Vera's house when she moved here herself. It was still on the windowsill, still cracked, still holding. She had never fixed the crack. She had decided the crack was part of what the jar was. She thought about everything that had come from the specific, improbable fact of coming to Redemption Creek in the spring of 1883 with that jar in her arms, and the conviction that men could not be trusted with fragile things. She thought about a man who caught eggs and wrapped bird wings and bought blue jars and came back from the pasture glad every morning. She had been right in a general way, which was how most convictions are right. They apply to the general case and fail to account for the exceptions. She had found the exception. She had found it by being careful and attentive, and by keeping her eyes open even when she was afraid of what they would show her. Stephen came and sat on the edge of the bed, and she handed Clara to him, and he held her with the same hands that held everything fragile, large and careful, and absolutely sure of their own steadiness. "She is furious about something," he observed. "She will always be furious about something," Lucy said. "She takes after me." He looked at her over the baby's head with a quiet smile. "I know," he said. "I am completely unprepared." She laughed, which was the best thing that happened in a day full of good things. By 1888, Redemption Creek itself had grown, as Texas towns were growing in those years, with the railroads extending and the cattle economy shifting, and new people arriving with new purposes. There was a second general store, a proper school, and a doctor's office that Dr. Finch had expanded. The copper spur remained the social axis of the rowdier elements, and the church remained the social axis of the others, and the two populations intersected more than either entirely admitted. Stephen had begun to be involved in the larger questions of the county land disputes, water rights, the relationships between the ranching operations, and the new farming claims that were appearing as more settlers arrived. These were complicated matters that he approached with the same patient deliberateness that he brought to the horse breeding. He did not pretend the complications did not exist. He did not pretend that everyone's interests were compatible. He worked at finding solutions that were fair even when they were not simple, and he had a reputation in the county for exactly this quality, which was rarer than it should have been. Lucy attended some of these meetings and heard him in action and was interested in him from a new angle, which was what you found in a good marriage. The person continued to open new angles as the years went on, new views of someone you thought you knew completely, and then realized you only knew the aspects they had shown you so far. She made sketches at the county meetings. Some of them appeared in the Abilene paper. There was some comment in the county about a woman attending these meetings and drawing the participants, and the comment was not uniformly positive, and she was direct about this to Stephen. "Some of your neighbors object to my presence at the meetings," she said. "I am aware," he said. "Does it create difficulties for you?" He looked at her with a straightforward expression that meant the question was not complicated. "No," he said. "You are doing your work. It is good work. If some of my neighbors cannot appreciate that, I am not able to solve their limitations for them." "You will hear about it," she said. "I have heard about it," he said. "I told Tom Granville that his difficulty with you was his own problem and that I found your perspective on the meetings considerably more useful than his." She smiled. "You said that to Tom Granville?" "I said it politely," he said. "But yes." Tom Granville was the largest landholder in the county, and a man with a considerable opinion of the appropriate social order. She liked very much that Stephen had said that to Tom Granville. The years continued, as years do, piling one atop the other with the accumulating texture of a life that is actively being lived. James turned 5 and started at the school and was, his teacher said, attentive and quiet and very precise about the way he formed his letters, which pleased Lucy for reasons she did not need to analyze. Clara turned 3 and was loud and determined, and attached to the horses with an intensity that suggested she had been planning this from before she was born. She followed Stephen to the pasture the moment she was allowed to and stood at the fence, and made her preferences clear about every horse that passed, which was admirable even when it was inconvenient. Vera turned 67 in 1889, and was, by Lucy's private assessment, the most alive 67-year-old she had met, her hip and all. She presided over the kitchen garden with the dedication of someone who has found their purpose and intends to discharge it fully. She told the children stories that were not quite the standard children's stories, full of dry observation about the nature of the world, and the children were fascinated by them. And Lucy suspected the stories were forming them in ways that would not become apparent until the children were older and found themselves knowing things they hadn't known they'd been taught. In the autumn of 1889, Stephen came home from a trip to Abilene with news that the horse program had attracted the interest of a breeding operation in Kentucky, which was a significant thing in the world of horses, because the Kentucky operations were serious and connected, and their interest was not casual. He told her over dinner, and she listened carefully and asked the questions she had become practiced at asking, which were the questions about the obligations and the risks and the timeline. It would mean a trip east, he said. Kentucky is not next door. No, she agreed. When? Spring, probably. They want to see some of the stock, have their people look at the breeding records. He paused. I would like you to come. She considered this. The children, she said. Vera and Eliza can manage. It would be 2 weeks. Kentucky, she said. She had not been east of Texas in years. She found herself thinking about what it would look like, what she would draw. You could bring your sketchbooks, he said. She smiled. He always knew exactly where her mind went. They went to Kentucky in April of 1890, leaving James and Clara in the capable care of Vera, who took the responsibility with the air of a general receiving a new command. The trip east was the longest journey Lucy had made since her arrival in Texas 7 years before, and the landscape changed around them as the train moved through it. The flatness of Texas softening into the rolling green of Tennessee, and then the particular beauty of Kentucky, which was its own thing entirely. She filled 2 sketchbooks on the trip, and produced work that Alderton later said was some of the finest she had sent him. She drew the countryside and the horse farms and the people they met at the Kentucky operation, which was large and formal and impressive, and she drew Stephen in 1 or 2 moments when he was concentrating on something and did not know she was looking, and these sketches were her favorites because they caught the quality of him that she could not always describe in words, the steady, focused presence that was the center of who he was. The Kentucky deal was made, modestly but well. They rode home on the train, and she leaned against his shoulder in the late afternoon of the second day and watched Texas come back into the window, the sky opening out into that enormous pale blue and the land flattening and extending. Glad to be going back, he asked. Very, she said. Are you? I am always glad to be going back, he said. He meant the ranch. He meant James and Clara and Vera and the horses and the kitchen with the cracked jar and the blue jar on the windowsill. He meant the whole particular life they had built in it. So am I, she said. They returned to find James had learned to whistle in their absence, and Clara had convinced Vera to let her name 2 of the barn cats, which she had done with considerable seriousness, calling them Button and Marshall. The names stuck. The cats accepted them with the indifference of cats everywhere. The decade turned, and the life of the ranch continued with its rhythms of work and season and growth. Stephen and Lucy had been married 7 years, and they were, by any measure she cared to apply, happy in the way that happiness is when it is not a destination but a quality of the traveling. There were difficult months, a hard winter in 1891 that tested the herd and the finances, a dry summer in 1892 that tested the garden and the well, the loss of 2 of the older horses to illness in the same year that made Stephen quieter for a week and made her know to stay close without requiring conversation from him. There were ordinary frictions, disagreements about decisions and resources, and occasional failures of patience. They were 2 people with strong opinions, and they did not always occupy the same opinion simultaneously. But they managed these things in the way they had always managed things, by talking about them directly until the shape of an answer emerged, and by trusting that the foundation beneath the friction was solid enough to hold. It was solid enough. She knew this the way she knew the things she had tested and found true. In the summer of 1893, James turned 9 and Clara turned 6, and they were unmistakably their parents' children. James precise and observant and thoughtful, Clara direct and determined, and fascinated by animals to the degree that Dr. Finch had begun to discuss with Stephen whether there might be a future in veterinary work if the field opened to it by the time she was grown, which was an unusual conversation for 1893, but not an impossible one. Clara had opinions about this conversation that were forthright and entirely in favor of the possibility. Lucy turned 36 in 1893 and felt, for the first time in her life, precisely the age she was, which was neither young enough to be unformed nor old enough to be finished. She felt like someone who had arrived at a place and recognized it as the place she had been trying to get to. She stood one morning in September in the kitchen with her coffee, the early light on the windowsill, the cracked jar and the blue jar both catching the gold of it. The house was quiet, Stephen out with the horses, the children still sleeping, Vera's gentle movement in the next room suggesting she was awake but not yet requiring the day. Outside the window, birds in the elm tree, the particular smell of autumn coming, that dry sweetness of cooling air. She looked at the two jars on the windowsill. The cracked one that had survived the journey from San Antonio, the blue one that had been given to her at the summer fair by a man who had seen her standing in front of it and understood why. She had put a sprig of fresh lavender in each of them. She thought about the woman who had arrived in Redemption Creek in the spring of 1883 with those convictions made of wound-over-wound evidence, and she thought about how thoroughly that woman had been shown something different, not by argument, not by reassurance, by watching, by specific daily repeated evidence accumulating into something undeniable. He had been careful with every small thing, and she had watched him be careful, and it had changed her mind. The kettle on the stove began to sing. She heard, from outside, Stephen's voice saying something to one of the horses in that low, continuous murmur, steady and unhurried, and she heard the horse respond. She heard Vera's cane on the floor of the sitting room. She heard James turn over in his bed. She poured the water into the pot and stood in the kitchen and felt the day beginning around her, the day and all the days it connected to. Backward to the spring morning, she had arrived carrying a cracked jar, and forward into all the mornings still to come. Stephen came in from outside 20 minutes later, cold on his coat, color in his face, and he looked at her from the doorway the way he always did, the way he had always done, like something he was glad to return to, and she looked back at him the same way. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. She poured him a cup. He came to the table and sat, and she set the cup in front of him, and his hand closed over hers for a moment, warm and steady. Clara came running in from the hallway in her nightgown, full of morning energy and immediately interested in the barn cats, who had apparently gotten into the storage room again. James appeared behind her, rubbing his eyes, and joined the conversation about the cats with the calm of an older sibling who had learned to manage enthusiasm with patience, which he had clearly inherited. Stephen listened to both of them with his full attention, and then made a practical suggestion about the storage room latch that satisfied both the cat's access and the children's concern, which was, Lucy thought, exactly what he did, found the solution that accounted for all the things that mattered. Vera came in and declared she would make breakfast if someone would get the fire going properly, and Stephen did, and the kitchen filled with the warmth of it and the smell of it, and the general productive noise of a family morning on a working ranch in Texas in the last decade of the 19th century. Lucy sat at the table with her coffee and her sketchbook open to a new page. She looked at her family moving through the morning, Stephen at the stove fire, James watching the cats through the window with an expression of patient interest, Clara telling Vera something important about the relative personalities of Button and Marshall, Vera listening with exactly the level of engagement that the subject warranted. She picked up her pencil. She began to draw, not because she needed to understand this. She understood it. She drew it because she wanted to keep it, to hold it in exactly the form it was in, the morning light and the warm kitchen and the people she loved moving through it. All of them here, all of them well, all of them hers and she theirs. The pencil moved across the paper with the precise and certain line of someone who has learned to see clearly and has learned to trust what she sees. And in the sketchbook that would outlast all of them, the morning was kept whole, intact, unbroken, exactly as it was.